This episode is on the mobilization for the Civil War. This picture is of Richmond, Virginia after the war is over. You can see what damage they could do even in the 1860s. We would see soon in the 20th century equal damage, but boy did they really do destruction to Richmond during the Civil War. So the firepower of both sides could certainly blow a city to smithereens even in the 19th century. This episode is subtitled "A Nation Divided Against Itself Cannot Stand," which is a line out of one of Lincoln's speeches, and so shows us a little bit of where the president stood. And Lincoln, remember, has been elected president, and after his election we just want to remind ourselves of a few things that are going on. 7 states secede in between the November election and the March 21st first inaugural. Representation in Congress worried the 7 states that seceded. So the 7 states in the South that seceded from the Union were worried that the Congress was overrepresented by states who were against slavery. They were now worried about a Republican president who had given a speech that slavery was an economic, a political, and a moral wrong. Also, you want to remember all the things leading up to the elections, the conflict over Kansas, the Dred Scott opinion, the 1850 compromise, which 10 years earlier, was very difficult to pass in Congress, and so they had to compromise, and that's part of the significance of the 1850 compromise as well as its specific provisions. But remember all that culture leading up to the Civil War, right? And especially the North, as many of you have written to me, a reforming culture, lots of abolitionists. Some of you even wrote that Douglas provided a incentive, was trying to convince Northerners, a greater portion of the Northerners, to join the abolitionist cause. So you can see why these 7 states felt that the South could not oppose the North in any sort of claim that might alter the Constitution and their ability to continue a slave society. So these 7 states seceded, and secession then occurred in Buchanan, who was the president right before Abraham Lincoln, who's from November to March is in what we call a lame duck period, when the president can either choose to do everything or nothing. In the case of Buchanan, he chose to do nothing, so we call that a lame duck period of the presidency. The Congress does make a last effort, however. They will pass the Crittenden Compromise, and the provision of the Crittenden Compromise is that the 36th and 30 parallel would be the line above which no slavery would take place, below which slavery could exist. Now remember, the 36-30 parallel was the Missouri Compromise in 1820, and they had put Missouri above this 1336 parallel, oddly enough. Lincoln rejects the Crittenden Compromise, so that was the last effort on the part of the Congress to find some compromise between the 2 sections of the United States, and 2 now adamantly opposed sections. You have written to me about Lincoln's first inaugural, whether he's trying to pacify the South or whether he is threatening the South, and there's a little bit of both, I think, in that first inaugural, although I think it tends more towards convincing the South that the North was, and he was, a threat to their slave society, although he does say he believes in the Constitution. For the South, the problem is, will the Constitution be altered? So South Carolina, leading, took itself and the Deep South with it, and that's where the 7 states come from. South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Kentucky, and North Carolina. They will set up their first capital in Montgomery, Alabama, and then they would quickly move it to Richmond, Virginia, which is about 70 to 90 miles away from Washington, D.C. So this is going to be an interesting civil war with the capitals finally only less than 100 miles apart, which is why the eastern theater of battle was so much more disastrous. Here's a picture of the final gray states that seceded from the Union. You can see all the way up Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, Tennessee, and Florida. Now the red states are the most important because they are slave states that will stay in the Union. So Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland were all slave states that stayed in the Union, and that will be key to the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln will pass in 1863. All right. The first fighting will occur at Fort Sumter, and the South basically wants to take Fort Sumter that sits off of Charleston in South Carolina, wants the arms, and also just to claim it so that it's a federal property, remember, because there's a fort that sits on it and it's a federal fort. So what the South intends to do is take that federal fort and of course use it for its own defenses in South Carolina. So they will bombard the fort for 2 days. The Union General Anderson tries to defend the fort. The Confederacy will win the battle over Sumter, and the Civil War will begin at this time. So that's the significance of Fort Sumter. It's the first shots heard in the Civil War. Now let's look at the strengths of either side. The North is an industrial economy, as we know, and as you know, so it has not limitless, but it certainly has a lot more supplies available for its military than the South does. It has, as we've looked at, crisscrossed railroad lines in the South with very few railroad lines, so it can transport things everywhere. And we also know that the telegraph allows for communication, and it has a set-up government. So obviously D.C. is the central governing region, and for the North it's already a done deal in every sense of the word, that they have all the positions filled and they have offices and a whole system by which governing and government has already been set up. So those are definitely the strengths of the North. The weaknesses of the North is that most of the battlefields, all except 2, will be in the South. They will then have a distance to get their supplies into the South. The population is free, democratic, and divided, so there are Copperheads who were opposed to the war with the South. They were Democrats opposed to the war with the South. They will also have military leadership problems. Now the South, in comparison to the South, this is a weakness with the North. The North and Lincoln are changing up generals to lead the war one after the other during the Civil War. I think Lincoln has somewhere around 9 different generals in 4 years, while the South has one general in its eastern theater in 4 years, and that is Robert E. Lee. So the consistency of the leadership in the South was, the military's leadership in the South was much stronger. And the North, Lincoln was trial and error, basically. So the Southern strengths, they're going to have a defensive war on their own turf. They will have a largely uniformly committed population, at least not quite as much dissent as the North had. The British and the French will favor them and will kind of give them aid, but they never fully support the South. But we'll look at that in a few minutes. and finally the military commanders. And as I said, Robert E. Lee will lead the Southern Army for 4 years, so they will have a definite consistency and advantage in their military for other reasons as well. But the South's weaknesses then are sort of all those strengths of the North, right? It's non-industrial, there's few railroads, very difficult to get your men places. They have a wholly new government that they have to organize and put together, and then trying to get the resources was made especially difficult because the South is seceding from the North partly because of states' rights. So they all believe strongly that the states should be the strong political element. So when it came to the South trying to raise money, for example, they had to wait for the states to raise taxes amongst their own citizens. So they didn't have the broad resources or the broad ability that the federal government in the North had to organize for the war. So the states' rights and the divide between all the states was somewhat difficult in the South, so a little bit of a weakness. And finally, it doesn't have the same manpower, and many of you have written about that in your essays, that the northern population is somewhere around 22 million at the Civil War, and the South's population is 8 million. 8 million. So they definitely did not have as much manpower. Mobilization for the North took a political effort by the federal government as well. We call it economic nationalism. It's not a new concept, but it means that you want to bind the nation together by developing the economy to be interconnected, right? So what did they do to do this? They passed a Homestead Act, which promised 160 acres to anybody who would go out to farm it, and if they improved it in 5 years, it was theirs. That was a generous Homestead Act, or they could pay for it at some minimal price. They started to build the Transcontinental Railroad, and that would finally be finished in 1869. The U.S. Treasury issued a paper currency called the greenback, which would last the war, and it would definitely hold its value a little bit better than the paper currency of the Confederacy. So financing the war was somewhat easier for the North since it had that big government backing and industrial base, right? So they raised taxes, they printed a currency that they used, they sold bonds to their citizens, and they raised lots of money to fight the South, who had a much more difficult time raising the money. The North could mobilize. They started with a 17,000 people army, and they added troops, right? They drafted in some cases, but they also got volunteers to build an army of about 700,000. Initially, they were very voluntary, and if you wanted to avoid the draft, you could pay $300 for somebody else to go as your replacement. By 1863, as the war dragged on, there were draft protests in the larger cities on the East Coast. In terms of leadership, the North had Lincoln, so he did prove to be a good leader even if he had limited experience in the military. He was part of the Illinois militia earlier in his life. He had also little experience really in politics, as he had only been a senator for a short period of time before he was elected president. Nonetheless, he engaged actively in the leadership of the nation and the leadership of the military, and with his generals was very active in making choices about war strategy. He actively silenced opposition, especially in and around D.C. In fact, he suspends habeas corpus to silence the Copperhead, the Democrats who were against the war in the North. And those Copperheads were, obviously caused problems for Lincoln as he tried to fight a war against a military that was much better than his. Right? So in 4 states only does Abraham Lincoln suspend habeas corpus. He does not wait for Congress to do some things, right? So he moved troops to battle before he had the official okay for war from Congress. He increased the army without a official consent of the Congress, and especially, as you can imagine, the purse, the finances for that. And he instituted a naval blockade of the South. All of this before the Congress gave him the okay to do it. He also passed, and this is a proclamation, so it doesn't require congressional agreement, but the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and that proclamation, as you know, freed all the slaves in the Confederacy, which means it did not free the slaves in the slave states that had stayed with the Union. And that's important. And I think it's easy to see why Lincoln did that. It was because he did not want to alienate 4 more slave states. So he freed only those slaves that were in states that were in rebellion against the United States. All right, mobilization in the South was much more difficult because they simply did not have the government. They moved it finally to Richmond, Virginia. They elected a president, Jefferson Davis, who didn't quite match up to Lincoln's aggressiveness in his job, right? Jefferson Davis was much more hesitant, maybe justly so, because he had Robert E. Lee running his military, but he was much more reticent and much more concerned about the things of daily office life, and less so about the broad concerns of warfare, right? Getting supplies, building a navy, where to direct troops to go, and again, in the terms of that last issue, strategy, he did have a great military to work with. And then finally, they lacked centralization, as I said, right? So all the states were states' rights. Most of the people in them took the position of states' rights, so it was very difficult to sort of organize the states into a central effort. So it's very strange. They had this great military that worked very well, and yet they had a hard time politically organizing the states, and so financing the war. It was not so easy to finance the war. You couldn't raise taxes in the states. You could print money if you were the South, but it was a big disaster. Their currency was worth almost nothing. They wanted to tax, but it was difficult to tax without the state's okay. And of course, if you've got such an unstable government and the printed money doesn't is a disaster, leads to this great inflation, nobody trusted the value of the money, then selling bonds is going to be very difficult. Your success in selling bonds is to the extent that the people think you're going to win the war. So it was not so easy to convince people, and especially in diplomacy, that they were going to be able to win the war. So the bonds did not always, I mean, obviously they had a lot of Southerners who supported the war regardless and bought bonds, but still it did not raise as much money as the South might have needed. The South will pass a conscription act, and so they quickly were drafting men, but they didn't seem to have too much problem with their men leaving the war involuntarily, leaving the war and deserting, right? So especially for the first 3.5 years of the war, they did not have very much desertion. But they raised a military of 500,000 against a 700,000 in the North, so they do have a concerted a concert of opinion amongst the Southerners. They also conscripted all males, 16 to 35, and only by 1864 were they starting to experience shortages in men, such that as the war came to a close, the North started to notice that many of the men fighting were very young, below 16 in many cases, boys that were fighting, and very old men that were fighting. And so that shortage was partly due to also a larger desertion rate by 1864. So in 1864-65 we see in the South that finds itself losing the war finally. 100,000 desertions, so it's only very late in the war. So the Southerners really supported their war effort. The impact of the war on the South, very quickly as we look at mobilization and then broadly, the blockade led to economic decline. Production went down in the South, not that it had a large industrial sector, by a third. The South had food riots, and the people often were starving. We know that the prisoners that they took from the North were all but starved to death in prisons in the South. So there was very limited supplies, whether for the army or for the civilian population in the South. Women in the South took up new roles as plantation leaders and as commercial leaders. They ran stores. They ran everything that the men left them to as they went off to war. And finally, the South started to institute and pass in their slaves and in their legislatures slave codes, and so very stringent laws to govern the slave population. And these slave codes, after the war is over, they will start to pass what are known as black codes. And those two would be harsh laws placed on blacks in the free, obviously, blacks in the South post-Civil War. But those slave codes were precedents for the black codes. Where did the British stand? As we said, they wanted to support the South. Remember, they buy 75% of the Southerners' cotton, so they had every reason to want to support it. They also would just like to make it difficult for the United States. So a divided United States was in the interest of everybody else in the international community, but especially Britain and France. So that was another reason they would be motivated to support the South. So cotton, but the British, so not sure that the South could win, that was the issue. They started to get their cotton from India and Egypt, especially as production of cotton went down. They had the interest, of course, in a weak U.S., and they never recognized the rebel state of the South, but they did do a few things to help it. So they weren't really quite neutral. And this is a picture of the Alabama. The British will build a ship for the South, the Alabama. So it did build a military, a ship that was a battleship for the South. I know it's got sails on it, so woo, it's that day and age. They also supported the Southerners when the Trent Affair happened, and the Trent Affair basically was that on a ship called the Trent, the Northerners stopped it, and there were 2 Southern diplomats going to Europe on it, and they arrested them shortly, and the British were on the side of the South looking for the freedom of these 2 diplomats. And they did support the South in that, and Abraham Lincoln held the diplomats for a couple of days because technically they are treasonous against the Union, and then he let them go. And the British again were on the side of the Southerners. Right? So that's a little bit about where the British stood. They definitely had an interest in weakening the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation, as we said, was passed, and earlier legislation abolished, remember these things, right? They abolished slavery in D.C. They passed a first Confiscation Act, but the second Confiscation Act was the important one, right? It's called a Confiscation Act because we're talking about property, technically, from the South that is confiscated. And these slaves then were allowed to fight in the war against the South. And that's what the Second Confiscation Act was about. That now slaves that had been freed from the South basically were able to choose to go fight against the South. The Emancipation Proclamation is passed in 1863. It freed, as we said, all the slaves in the Confederacy and not the border states. And these border states were states that stayed in the Union again. Again, those slave states that are still slave states after the Emancipation Proclamation are Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. All right, let's look at a few groups of people that now are in the Civil War and some of the roles that they play. As you know, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation, blacks joined the Union cause because they could now be in their own units. After the war is all over, a total of 186,000 blacks became soldiers. And after the, again, Emancipation Proclamation, enlistments were up. They had their own regiments, and the 54th Massachusetts Infantry is probably the most famous of the black regiments. Most blacks involved in the Civil War were not allowed to fight on the front lines, and they usually did auxiliary backup work, bringing supplies and working as cooks in the camps, etc. But they do have a couple of units that will fight in the war that are all black, right? And again, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry was one of those units. Very unequal conditions in the war, and so, as I said, they were not allowed to be have positions. Mostly they had auxiliary positions. They did not get the same wages as the other soldiers as well. They also had special treatment by the South if they were caught, and they would be immediately executed by the South if they were caught, whereas the South took prisoners of the other soldiers. Native Americans joined both sides in the Civil War. Of the 5 civilized tribes, remember the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and the Seminole. Most of them joined in with the South if they did. Some, as here, a lieutenant, brigadier general, Parker on the right-hand side, who is a Native American, was in the northern Army, right? So the Plains Indians tended to go with the North. Women also played roles in the war. As you know, nursing for women becomes an occupation, and Clara Burton would be the first and most well-known of the nurses in the Civil War. Remember that the suffragettes joined in, and just women in general, as abolitionists. Both Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were abolitionists and spreading the word of abolition. In the South, they ran plantations, as I said. But we have about 200 women that were acted as spies for the South. And the way that they could do this was Richmond, Virginia was very close to D.C., and many of them still engaged in socializing in D.C. So they would, by ways of socializing through their social connections, they would get information about the Northern cause, and they would bring it to Southern generals. And they brought some very important information to Lee, so they were very helpful to the South, these spies, in the Southern strategy. All right, so that's some of the different groups in the war, and the next episode then we'll look at the Civil War and the battlefields of the Civil War.